We have Alan Levin, and he's talking about Jung, alchemy, and altered states, which I'm sure we could talk about all weekend. It's quite a vast subject, but I'm going to let Ed introduce him.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our monthly lecture series. And I'm Ed Tick. I'm a member of the board of directors, as Erica shared, and one of our regular lecturers. And I just want to reiterate what Erica said, whether this is your first time here or you're a regular attendee. We really love doing this. We love this work. We love the way it deepens our lives together in our community and our own life journeys. And so thank you for joining us. Please do donate, because as Erica said, that's all we live on, except our goodwill and love for each other in the work. And thank you very much. So I'm very honored to introduce Alan Levin. Alan is a dear friend and colleague of many, many years. Alan has been a psychotherapist since 1985, so 35 years and counting. He established the Holos Institute in California, which was an eco-psychology therapy and education center there. And he moved to New York in 2004, lives near Bear Mountain in a very beautiful, almost wilderness on the edge of urbanity and loving and connecting to wilderness. And he uses that in his work very much as well. With Alan's wife, Ginny Brooke, they established and work as Sacred River Healing. Alan studied yoga during the 1970s, and he has been integrating that work into shamanism and mindfulness meditation for the last several decades. Presently, because of his big love of the world and the crises we're in, Alan has been focusing on the integration of psycho-spiritual work with social and political action. He has a wonderful book that's quite fascinating out. It's called Crossing the Boundary. Here it is. It's deep conversations and explorations with Jewish leaders who have adopted and become masters of other spiritual paths. So it's quite interdisciplinary, quite universalistic, and relevant to all of our growth and work. And it reflects Alan too, because Alan's a lifelong practitioner and teacher of several esoteric traditions, and he integrates them really beautifully into one unified healing vision and practice. And I'm not reading it from printed bio. Alan and I have been friends and colleagues for many years. We've done sacred work together, and I do affirm that he is a wise, loving, compassionate guide to journeys through the inner world. So with that, Alan, thank you for joining us. Bless you, and we turn the evening over to you.
I'm not muted, right? Yeah. So hello, everybody. It's good to meet you. I haven't seen all of your faces before. So thank you, especially Ed, for helping put this together, inviting me to make this presentation and have a conversation with you about this intersection of some very interesting subjects, which in themselves could involve many, many talks. So Jung, altered states of consciousness, alchemy, and psychedelics. I think that wasn't in the title, the word psychedelics, but I'm hoping most of you recognized that was going to be part of the discussion. So because all of this, all of those things I mentioned, Jung, alchemy, is based in experiential work, I want to start with a relatively short meditational experience, a kind of alchemical process. I originally learned it as a Taoist exercise, but it's very much alchemical, and you'll see what I mean, I think, if you'll go along with me. Take this moment right now to close your eyes and shift your attention to your breath And I'm sure all of you have done this many, many, many times, I'm guessing. And what I always like to suggest to people is act as if this is the very first time you're doing this. And you're exploring the sensations, the feelings of breathing, whatever they are in this moment. Now, if you would direct your attention to a line of energy, or just a vertical line that runs from above the top of your head, right down through the very top of your head, down through the center of your body, and goes all the way down between your legs, between your feet, and down below. And allow your weight, your physical weight of your body, to shift just a little bit onto your left buttocks, and your head and your body shift over a little bit to the left. So you're on the left of this central axis line, and then go to the right and you'll cross over the center, and then come back, and you might, like a pendulum, go back and forth just a little bit until you kind of feel like you're right there in the center, balancing these polarities of right and left. And now take your hands and your arms and reach up, just as much as is comfortable for the way your shoulders are at this point, aiming your palms toward the upward direction. And just think of yourself as reaching up with your attention, your awareness, up through the roof of whatever building you're in, into the sky. And of course, now there's the stars, whether they're visible or not. The moon is close to full, and the heavens. And whatever it is that you, in your own way of thinking, hold as what is above, what is up above. And then bring your hands and arms down and let your palms face into your heart, the heart center area, the middle of your chest. And then, if you can, lean forward and aim your palms down toward the earth. Depending on how you're sitting, that you may touch or may not, just aim your palms down toward the earth, same way you did toward the sky. And think and let your attention, your awareness go all the way deep down through the floor and foundation of your house and down into the earth, deep into the earth, into Mother Earth. And however you hold her, your Mother Earth, Gaia, the planet, just imagine her energy coming up as you bring your palms back up and your hands back up, and you sit back up and you bring your hands to your center of your chest and your heart. And in this way, we're balancing the two polarities of above and below. Some would say heaven and earth, spirit and matter. And bringing it into the center of our heart, where we can feel that energy balancing and healing. Okay. So Andy, if you would bring up the first slide. This is just a little bit of an outline of what I'll be trying to talk about with you, discuss with you. Jung, altered states, alchemy, and I put in small print there, psychedelics, because it's just to give a little bit of a humorous hint that it's a bit of a taboo, has been a bit of a taboo subject for so long, and we're kind of bringing it out of the closet as it has been coming into the mainstream world more, and seen as a possibly very, very potent aid in many forms, many aspects of therapy, spiritual growth, healing. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience. I'll talk about Jung and altered states as I kind of understand it, and Jung and psychedelics. What did he have to say about psychedelics? I'll give a little bit more information about the kind of experiences that go along with the altered state process of using these kinds of substances. And then I wanted, I think it's a little bit humorous, but it's really true. Why do people who use psychedelics love Jung? And then we'll talk about Jung and alchemy and do a more in-depth kind of experience with an alchemical process or divination that I think, and hopefully we'll have time for all that, I think you'll find very interesting and helpful. So the next slide. Yeah, I wanted to just quickly go over some of the resources that I used in preparing for this talk. Of course, there's volumes and volumes on each aspect of this subject, but I particularly looked at the volume 20 of the Bollingen series, Collected Works of C.G. Jung, Psychology and Alchemy. Two really excellent YouTube lectures that you could Google and find of Ralph Metzner talking about Jung. And I'll talk a little bit more about Ralph Metzner, but he was one of my longtime friends and teachers, and really a very great visionary in terms of bringing in new ways of thinking about the ancient wisdom. So these are two of the YouTube series. Of course, the Red Book, few books by Ralph Metzner, Alchemical Divinations, Mind, Space, and Time Stream, Allies for Awakening. These books are, I think, all available at the website that's devoted to his work, called Green Earth Foundation. He passed over close to 2 years ago now, I believe. So they're keeping his work, republishing some of his books. Very interesting article called Psychedelic Drugs and Jungian Therapy that was published in the Journal of Jungian Scholarly Studies. And can you scroll down, Andy? This is a book which I actually haven't read, but I've read parts of it that really lays out in greater depth than I'll be able to tonight a lot of what I'll be talking about. As he called it, Confrontation with the Unconscious, Jungian Depth Psychology and Psychedelic Experience, Scott J. Hill. So those are some of the resources that I used. If you would, the next slide. Got talk a little bit about my own experience with altered states, with psychedelics. I was in my early 20s, in college years, when I was introduced to LSD, and that really changed my life. It put me in a whole new direction, from a very outer-oriented person, very unable really to appreciate almost anything of an aesthetic nature, to one who is really transformed in that regard. Most of those experiences were a bit haphazard. I took it seriously, but there was no training, there was no real serious guidance. A lot of us just read books and maybe went into the woods or found ourselves in places where we took these substances, found ourselves in altered states and tried to make sense out of it. I was led to a more disciplined spiritual practice. It's called Agni Yoga. It's a yoga that involves deep meditative work, tapping into life energy. And it was part of a Western esoteric school that taught this process, and really helped me to discipline my mind a lot more. And all of that time period, for the most part, was without any of my earlier hippie day use of substances. It was all quite without that kind of amplification. However, in fact, it was sort of a rule of the school, as it is for many spiritual groups and schools, that people not use any kind of drug or any kind of substance. I don't know whether that's changing along with the coming out of the new research and so forth that's going on. But we weren't using them, and when I left that school, I was reintroduced to a whole different way of making use of psychedelic substances, in a much really a very, very deeply respectful, very, very carefully controlled setting, and with preparation. And I was introduced at that time to ketamine and MDMA, which is an empathogen. I can talk more if people have questions about any of these substances, maybe more afterwards. But that was my reintroduction, and it took me on a whole new kind of path, because the practices that I had learned to do in meditation were completely amplified and made much more vivid and much more real through the use of the substances in these kinds of settings. So then I spent since that time, in California, when I lived in California, I participated in having both individual sessions with teachers, and also participating and then becoming sort of an assistant to ceremonies where we used substances like MDMA, mushrooms, the psychedelic mushrooms, iboga, which is an African root substance, and the synthetic that's derived from it, ibogaine, and ayahuasca. And so I also participated quite a few times with sometimes with the Native American Church, which uses peyote, and with the Santo Daime, which is a Brazilian syncretic church. In other words, it brings together the shamanistic use of ayahuasca with a kind of Christian church service, essentially, and church program. very, very interesting, very, very powerful, and it was very, very healing and helpful to me and my own journey. I think we can go to the next slide. Well, of course, I wanted to talk about Jung and altered states of consciousness, but before, question.
Alan, they want to know, several people want to know your definition of alchemy.
Okay, well, I am going to get to that, but
No problem. Why don't
just
you?
quickly,
That's fine.
just quickly, I would say alchemy is the process whereby we transmute transmute energy or whatever towards its true nature, towards its real nature. That would be my short take quote for it. But I also want to talk about what is a state of consciousness in the first place, because we're talking about altered states of consciousness. So what is a state of consciousness? What is an altered state of consciousness? I think the first thing we want to look at is the fact that we go through, in any given life cycle, day even, usually many different states of consciousness. Your waking state of consciousness is very different. It's usually rational and very different than, say, the dream state of consciousness that you're in when you're asleep, or other states that you go into in deeper sleep. It's also, we could have a rageful, road rage state of consciousness where you completely lose control of your rational mind. I don't imagine anybody in this group ever has that experience, but maybe when you were younger, you kind of did. And but William James, I like this quote from him, is that our normal waking consciousness, which we usually call rational consciousness, is but one special type of consciousness, while all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. And we can sometimes, often, not intentionally, flip from one state of consciousness to another, like, for example, if you go into a rage, or intentionally, which is what, of course, we would prefer, to choose our state of consciousness. A state of consciousness so varies throughout the day, and when we say it's an altered state of consciousness, we're really saying that it's just a very different one than we're used to. There's no specific state of consciousness that's an altered state of consciousness. In some cultures, people could be accustomed to a state of consciousness that's very different, and to us we would have to be in an altered state to experience it. Jung himself talks about, I'll get to it later, but in his foreword to the I Ching, he describes the Chinese mind that is in sync somehow with the I Ching as being very, very different than ours. Western mind. He compares the Western mind often to indigenous mind, the Eastern mind, and so forth, different states of consciousness. So states of consciousness can be destructive, they can be creative. Madness is a state of consciousness, while samadhi is a state of consciousness. Ralph Metzner, he defines a state of consciousness as the subjective space or field within which the different contents of consciousness, such as thoughts, feelings, images, perceptions, sensations, intuitions, memories, and so forth, function in patterned interrelationships. So that's a state of consciousness, you could say. So when we can ask ourselves at any given time during the day, what state of consciousness am I in? And we could begin to check it out. That's what an observing mind can start to cultivate. And he's referring when he talks about an altered state of consciousness, especially, well, the profound ones. He says that's when your subjective body image, a change in your subjective body image occurs with changes in the perception of time and space. So then you really have a very different, you know, you're not in your normal mode when you're experiencing something like that. When people enter into a psychedelic journey, for example, they very often are in this, if it's new to them, they're very often in this, am I feeling it? Am I not feeling it? Is what's going on? I'm not sure. I'm in and off. Just, and then at a certain point, they sort of cross a threshold. And, oh, yes, I get it. I'm in an altered state of consciousness. Ego death, where your sense of self-image is literally abolished. The self-image that you normally have of yourself. And again, ego death can be a nightmare like psychosis, or it can be a very, what is considered the highest form of spiritual experience, like nirvana. Altered states of consciousness, just added this line, challenge our unconscious tendencies and change our direction. Okay, so that's a little bit about what are states of consciousness. New message, is there a question there? Three worlds play into all this. I can't say I know. I can't answer that question about Karl Popper. Sorry. Okay, so I don't know if you can read this. I'm going to just talk from it. Jung clearly experienced altered states of consciousness, what we really think of as altered states of consciousness, very different, profoundly different from the ordinary rational place that we tend to live in Western culture. Here's, I'm going to read something from his near-death experience. Now, I know this is a Jung association, so am I doing something that you all already know about? Is everybody familiar with Jung's near-death experience? Not necessarily. Okay, good. I wasn't before I started looking into this. So he did. He had a near-death experience. And here's some of how he described it. The images were so tremendous that I myself concluded that I was close to death. Now, he was awake. This isn't a dream. It seems to me that I was high up in space. Far below, I saw the globe of the earth bathed in a gloriously blue light. Interesting, way before the astronauts saw anything like that. I saw the deep blue sea and the continents. Far below my feet lay Ceylon, and in the distance ahead of me, the subcontinent of India. Far away to the left lay a broad expanse, the reddish yellow desert of Arabia. I could also see the snow-covered Himalayas, but in that direction it was foggy and cloudy. I knew that I was on the point of departing from the earth. Later, I discovered how high in space one would have to be to have so extensive a view, approximately 1,000 miles. The sight of the earth from this height was the most glorious thing I had ever seen. That glorious feeling is also, see, that's a feeling aspect. He's having a vision, but he's also having a feeling. That's part of a state of consciousness. I was profoundly disappointed. For now, this comes later. For now, I must return to the, quote, box system again. For me, it seemed to me as if behind the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world had been artificially built up, in which each person sat by himself in a little box. You know, when I read this, I was reminded of early writings of Timothy Leary when he talked about his LSD experiences. And now, I should have to convince myself all over again that this was important. Life and the whole world struck me as a prison, and it bothered me beyond measure that I should again be finding that quite in order. I had been so glad to shed it all, and now it had come about that I, along with everyone else, would again be hung up in a box by a thread. Now that part of the experience, his re-entry, you could say, was not totally pleasant. He's talking about coming back to what he perceived to be almost like a prison. And so his near-death experience included this ecstatic aspect, and it also included a kind of despondent feeling about the quote, real world. So yeah, somebody texting question. Can you share your different, where am I?
Alan, people,
very deep.
Alan?
Yeah.
Oh, are you reading them?
I'm reading that one now that you wrote. Yeah, right. So this could be called active imagination, except he barely was doing active imagination. This kind of happened to him. And so that seems a little bit different, although I'll get into his use of active imagination in just a minute. I think we need the next slide. So here's a few ways in which myself, and again, I'm not a Jungian scholar, I'm not deeply read in terms of Jung, but I have an interest in him, and here's some of the things that struck me about coming from an altered state of consciousness. However he got there, through active imagination or through some sort of process that just seemed to take him over. Of course, the Red Book. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Red Book, and you see a whole bunch of descriptions of visions. And what seems very clear is that he, just as in that near-death experience, believes in the reality of that experience. So if by imagination we mean it's coming out of our mind, he's not thinking of it as that. He's thinking of accessing a reality outside of what our brain mind creates. And I think that's how he thinks of the soul, as I read it. And again, we can talk about this if people disagree. But he says, I thought and spoke much about the human soul. I knew many learned words for her. I had judged her and turned her into a scientific object. I did not consider that my soul cannot be the object of my judgment and knowledge. Much more are my judgment and knowledge the objects of my soul. Therefore, the spirit of the depths, also a spirit, forced me to speak to my soul, to call upon her as living, existing being. I had to become aware that I had lost my soul. He had lost his awareness of his soul, his connection as a person to his soul. So from the perspective of our ordinary way of thinking about reality, to experience a being, a non-physical being, as real, not coming from your mind, and you're sort of concocting a vision of it, involves an altered state of consciousness. We don't access those realities unless we're in an altered state of consciousness. Now, of course, if we get very, very used to having that kind of experience, communing with your soul, communing with spirits, then of course, for you, it wouldn't be such an altered state. It would be an ordinary state.
Alan?
Yeah.
There's some comments, the last about 10 comments you might want to look at in the chat. And
okay. Can that be known for sure about Jung's thought? Uh,
Even more
uh,
earlier.
I don't know what could be known for sure about his thought. It's how I read it, and that's kind of how I'm presenting it. It could be that looked. I'm quite sure, many Jungians look at it in a different way.
No, question.
I have not used psychedelic to induce this state. He was not using psychedelics. That's true. I'm going to get to that. I always wondered if he was indeed using psychedelics at all. This seems like quite extreme experience. It just happened to someone. Physical symptoms during re-entry. I don't believe he had physical symptoms, but he was, there's a whole story, I don't know if we want to get into it right now, where he believed that his physician, who appeared to him as a spirit in his experience, and his physician died shortly after, and he believes it had something to do with his physician bringing him back. That's sunlight can be, yeah, there's no question people can access altered states without psychedelics, absolutely. So nobody needs to ask me that anymore. I have had such experiences without medicines and have facilitated through dream work and vision questing. Yes, myself also. I've literally had to work in a box, and people who refuse to see or consider out of the box. It was soul crushing. How to continue to soar is indeed a challenge. Yes, I agree. Community is very, very important and helpful. Whether or not he's using them, no. Okay, I'm going to go on. Of course, the archetypes, and again, one can say that the archetypes are intellectual creations of the human mind. I believe Jung thought of them as that the collective consciousness was something that existed outside of the human brain. Okay, and I believe there was a reference in some, and I couldn't find it, maybe somebody else would know it, where he compared the archetypes to what people in earlier times called gods and goddesses. Active imagination, absolutely. He encountered beings in his active imagination, and as far as I can tell, he saw them as ontologically real. He also had prophetic experiences. Ordinary consciousness doesn't allow you to have prophetic experiences. You don't see into the future. You don't get messages about that. Okay, so could we listen to the presentation and then the comments? I've heard I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, appreciate that. I'll try to not answer questions if it looks like I'm going to answer it in a few minutes, if that's okay with you guys. Next one, Andy. Let's see. Yes, okay. I just wanted you to look at a series that I took out of either the Red Book or some other source of Jung's drawings, and see if you can't imagine them being on the cover of some psychedelic rock band. So take the next one. And of course, these are, yes, symbols, but they seem to be actually, I think Jung said they're actually visions. They're paintings of visions. So here, and very often in, especially ayahuasca and mushroom experiences, altered states, people experience a reptilian presence, a reptilian being that sometimes surrounds them, sometimes eats them. They get into, or eat, in the reverse, they eat that being. Next one. Of course, this fellow is fighting it. And of course, that's a tradition. Jung may have looked at it that way. The fighting with the reptilian consciousness, you know, that's a mode of working with it. And very often people have found that at a certain point, they come to a different resolution with that. And maybe in alchemy, that would be found, that we would transmute that energy, we would use that energy, we would, after all, it's a part of our evolution, it's a part of who we are, to have access to that visceral and innate intelligence of the reptile. But here, this fellow is sort of like in the night tradition, slaying the dragon, it looks like. The next one. Very often in altered states, people can encounter or feel as though they are in a very dark place, and haunting kind of feeling to it. Next one. Again, think of it as like when you have seen people who have done paintings and illustrations for altered states of consciousness of one kind or another. These are the kinds of things that you often see. Again, the snake, very, very important in sessions that, ceremonies and sessions where people go deep into their lower realms, you could say, of consciousness, lower and higher realms of consciousness. And the next one is one of the ways in which Jung integrated much of his learnings from his visions, the mandala and the balance that's portrayed. Has a lot of symbols in there and a lot of, but it's about center and balance. One of the watchwords that I learned that shaman or a guide in a session, a deep journey into an altered state would say just simply the word center. Center and balance. Center and balance. And if you would, for even just a moment, right now, we originally, when we did that short meditation, I suggested you think of a line, a central vertical line, and you can center and balance with that at any time during this talk. More important than hearing what I'm saying. Okay, so yeah, and the last piece I want to say about Jung and altered states, and again, this doesn't have to be, do you have that one, Andy? Yeah, is opening the heart. For an intellectual, which maybe some people on this call, this Zoom call are, opening the heart is an altered state of consciousness. Entering into a complete state of empathic attention to whatever is happening is an altered state of consciousness. And in fact, there are substances which are called empathogens, which are sort of different in the realm of psychedelic options from the stronger, more mind-expanding substances. And there are ones like MDMA and 2CB and sometimes San Pedro is another one. It's a cactus plant. And Jung opened his heart. Jung had deep heart experiences. And so like in the Red Book, the knowledge of the heart is in no book or in no one's mind, and is not to be found in the mouth of any teacher, but grows out of you like the green seed from the dark earth. The knowledge of your heart is how your heart is. From a cunning heart, you will know cunning. From a good heart, you will know goodness. And the last piece about Jung and altered states is that, again, he said, I had to learn that I am only the expression and symbol of the soul. The I, the personal self, the one that I think I am, is really an expression of the soul. And Of course, that's a view that comes from almost all of the world's spiritual traditions, that consciousness, spirit, precedes the personal self and even the physical body, and is at the source of what creates our mind and our body. Our mind doesn't create the soul creates the mind. And I think, again, that however one approaches entering into an altered state, that is a kind of altered state view from our traditional Western mindset. Okay, so now Jung himself and psychedelics. We know Jung appreciated altered states of consciousness, although I don't know that he used that term. But the next slide. So Jung evidently was offered either LSD or mescaline. I'm not sure. I think maybe he was confused about it because he didn't know that much about it. And this was in 1954. And in a very long letter to a Dominican priest, Father Victor White, and again, some of you may be familiar with this, I don't know. It's quite a famous letter, communication, correspondence that he had with this priest. He wrote about the idea of taking mescaline or LSD. He said, "I only know there is no point in wishing to know more of the collective unconscious than one gets through dreams and intuition. The more you know of it, the greater and heavier becomes our moral burden, because the unconscious contents transform themselves into your individual tasks and duties as soon as they begin to become conscious. Do you want to increase loneliness and misunderstanding? Do you want to find more and more complications and increasing responsibilities? You get enough of it. If I once could say that I had done everything I know I had to do, then perhaps I should realize a legitimate need to take mescaline." So his answer was no. And as far as anybody knows, he never did. He goes on. The letter's very long, and the part where he talks about his thoughts about taking a psychedelic is also kind of long, but I took these segments out. "There are some poor, impoverished creatures, perhaps, for whom mescaline would be a heaven-sent gift without a counterpoison. But I am profoundly mistrustful of the pure gifts of the gods. You pay very dearly for them." So for several reasons that he explains in this letter, he chose not to take any psychedelics. I guess one could say, for one thing, he didn't want any more. He didn't want any more of what Jung calls the unconscious to come up and have to deal with it. He felt like he was getting quite enough. And his view, of course, not having ever taken it, was that this would actually become even more of a load on that. And go to the next slide, and I wanted to just see there's some responses in the book that I mentioned in the resources earlier on by Scott J. Hill. He spends a lot of time on this whole subject because that's what he's writing about, Jung's thoughts on psychedelics. And he says, it points out, interestingly, and this I don't know why this would be the case, but he points it out that despite Jung's extensive writings about the spiritual practices of indigenous peoples, he did not discuss how commonly hallucinogenic drugs were used in other cultures to induce mystical states and religious experiences. despite his deep and abiding interests in the spiritual experiences of non-Western people, Jung did not seem to acknowledge how frequently spiritual practices in those cultures involve drug use. So it's just a thought to throw out there. It's no, I don't have an answer to why he sort of selectively took a great interest in the practices of people, except for the fact that they're taking these substances. In a way, it was the prevailing way of looking at indigenous people and people from other cultures amongst anthropologists, for example, as well, to just sort of observe that they do it, but not to even imagine that this could be something that would be relevant to us. He takes parts out of the letter that Jung wrote to the priest, and he responds to them. He says, Jung was also concerned that psychedelic drugs would create a problem analogous to that faced by the sorcerer's apprentice, who learned from his master how to call the ghosts. That's the phrase he used. And he refers to Aldous Huxley, who in 1954 came out with the book Doors of Perception Between Heaven and Hell. Maybe some of you are familiar with that book. It was a very seminal book in the reading of people who were beginning to explore altered states of consciousness and psychedelics, because Aldous Huxley writes, very beautifully about his own experience involving both positive and negative, heaven and hell. And he wrote that in the same year. So it's probable that Jung was aware of Huxley's writing, and he's kind of critical, saying that he doesn't know that he is in the role of this, I don't know how to pronounce that word, Zauberling, who learned from his master how to call the ghosts, but did not know how to get rid of them. And I think that referred to that sorcerer's apprentice idea. That so Jung was very concerned about the naive use of psychedelics and the fact that people were experiencing deep, deep altered states of consciousness without doing the work that he felt was necessary to make it a constructive and integrative experience. So legitimate, totally legitimate. And I think people who are now bringing the use of psychedelics back into a legitimate research in both what's called the overground and the underground world are quite aware, for the most part, of that. We'll see how that goes as things start to mushroom out into the wider culture. He was concerned that psychedelics might be used out of idle curiosity. Like, oh, I want to have a strange experience, I'll take mushrooms, which of course people do. And he says this is really the mistake of our age. We think it's enough to discover new things, but we don't realize that knowing more demands a corresponding development of our morality. Now, this is a big point that Jung makes. And again, I'm aware that this is a major discussion amongst people who are making use of psychedelic substances these days in serious ways. There is a moral element that has to be addressed, both in terms of how the sessions are conducted and also what the purpose of them is. It's true that one can, there is the term psychonaut, which is kind of like a curiosity to just travel through your psyche and have wild, incredible experiences. And Jung would be very concerned, and I'd be very concerned, that there's no intention to make that experience helpful to even that person's growth, healing, and especially even of the world. So in our current materialistic culture, and this is Scott Hill's response to the idea that maybe there are some people out there, poor, impoverished creatures, who could benefit from this. And he says, Scott Hill says, in our current materialistic culture, where spirituality is dogmatically marginalized, there may be more of such poor, impoverished creatures than Jung may have imagined. For these individuals, hallucinogens could be a heaven-sent gift. Okay, so that was his take on psychedelics, and largely negative with those reasons. Now, what's interesting is that as much as Jung himself disapproved of or didn't think much very positively of psychedelics, people who use psychedelics love Carl Jung. And here are some of the reasons from very, very early on. People, now I have also heard that Jung wasn't always so fond of the fact that people glommed on to some of his teachings without really doing the deep work. But that may be a valid concern. But what Jung did that psychedelic users really, really appreciated was that he gave them a language for their experience. And there's something I once heard from Stan Grof, who was one of the earliest psychiatrists who made use of psychedelics back when it was legal at Maryland, at the medical college there. And he introduced thousands of people and supervised thousands of sessions. And he at one point said something along the lines of, you literally can't have an experience that you can retain if you don't have a language for it. And usually, even if you don't have the language before you have the experience. I myself, when I first took LSD, I was completely naive to any languaging of spirituality, and wasn't even familiar with the word consciousness. The only way I understood consciousness was radical consciousness, meaning that you had the right political views, or the left political views, which was what was the right political views. So consciousness wasn't a word for me. And when I was having this experience, I was really kind of lost. And it made sense to me later that when I started learning that exists, that consciousness exists. It's just a word, and it may seem odd right now, but that was really true for me, and other experiences as well. The experience of that Jung provides by having the word archetypes, like collective unconscious, synchronicity. People who have experiences with altered states often feel that things are happening that are not causally related, that have meaning with each other for the person, subjective meaning. And that he used that term, coined the term synchronicity. Very helpful. He also wrote the foreword to the most popular translation of the I Ching. And he said that he actually made use of the I Ching for 30 years and took a great interest in it. And it seems also very clear that you can't really get the I Ching in ordinary consciousness. So he honored Eastern spirituality, traveled and talked to gurus and saints, Native American, indigenous wisdom, referred to that. These were all things that people who were exploring altered states, psychedelics, were beginning to open up to. They spoke to them in ways that what we learned in school didn't speak to us. And even Western philosophy didn't seem to speak to, or the religions as they were taught didn't seem to speak to. So Stan Groff writes, who was also a great appreciator of Carl Jung, writes that Philemon explained how Jung treated thoughts as though they were generated by himself, while for Philemon, thoughts were like animals in the forest, or people in a room, or birds in the air. Jung concluded that Philemon taught him psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. This helped Jung to understand that there is something in me which can say things that I do not know and do not intend. So there's the play with I. Things in me that I do not understand, that I did not know, that I did not intend, and yet they're coming from some kind of higher source. Erica, was there something I should respond to?
I wanted you to just say who Philemon was. Probably most people don't know.
Well, Philemon is a being who became one of Carl Jung's teachers that he experienced in his visionary states. That would be my short answer. And he experienced many beings, or a number of different beings that he referred to. And it's kind of confusing reading him, I have to say. You have to really pay attention. He refers to these beings, what they're saying to him, clearly he was in a very, very different place. He wasn't in Kansas anymore, like they say. This is what I said before, you need a language to describe a mystical experience, even though everybody that has a mystical experience says that there's no way that you can describe a mystical experience. And yet it's helpful to have some kind of language that helps us to grok it, to file it, to keep it in our world. My dog Luna is in another state of consciousness, and she's not interested in this lecture right now. Again, symbols, archetypes, collective unconscious, these were all things that folks who were opening up to these altered state experiences had resonance to. Okay. Next one. Okay, so this is about, now we're getting into more, we're talking about Jung and alchemy. I don't know that I want to read all of that, but I want to just remind everybody that Jung had a very, very deep interest in alchemy. My understanding is that 4 of the collected works are focused on alchemy. I had that one that I was referring to before. Some of you may know this. It's called Psychology and Alchemy. Big book. Jung himself, he dove into it. He went to the original texts, these medieval texts from alchemists that were published, and translated them and applied them to his psychoanalytic work. He basically saw that the alchemists were, he kind of was probably instrumental in reviving the true understanding of alchemy, because for many, many years, people had written it off as a kind of hocus pocus kind of effort to take mineral substances and change them into valuable substances, to change lead, actual lead, into gold. And Jung, in reading this, saw very clearly that and they even said, and he found ways in which they were saying, that's not what we're saying. We're not doing that. What we're doing is we're transforming, the consciousness of the ordinary human person from a heavy, depressed, lethargic, unawakened state to a very, so using the metaphor of lead to gold. Again, I'm not sure how much I'm saying that people here are not already very familiar with. He understood that it was a map and an instruction manual that he was attempting to decipher and apply to understanding people's dreams. Because people would have dreams and they would see images that corresponded, or the sequence of the imagery would correspond to the sequence of changes that the alchemists were talking about in their words and pictures. And I'll show those in some of the pictures in a few minutes that will explain. Yes, question? So I was purely metaphorical, and then by game of telephone, it became a literal wise tale about physical lead and gold. Readings, etc. Yeah, the only reason I'm hesitating on completely agreeing with what you're saying is they were using metaphors, but they were also talking about a very literal process, a very somatic process. And this is where I think Jung, and I kind of got this from Ralph Mitzner, differed from what alchemists were actually doing and what perhaps we are capable of doing when we apply alchemical processes to ourselves. Jung saw them, the processes that were described by the alchemists as metaphors for states of consciousness, and changes in states of consciousness, and changes in the whole process of individuation, growth. What I think he didn't get, and again, this could be open to discussion, is that the actual vessel of transformation was the body, was the energies of the body and the energies of the system that make up the person. I'll get into that a little bit more. So in other words, the alchemists were doing something that wasn't just a metaphor for a psychological event, it was a metaphor for a literal biochemical transformation. And that is one of the things that we find happens in deep experiences with some of the psychedelic substances that may be less likely to happen with active imagination, unless perhaps the person is very somatically trained to have somatic awareness. I guess here's the definition. Somebody asked about this before. The definition of alchemy that I'm using is it's a process of transmutation by which to fuse, meaning to unify with, or reunite with the divine or the original form. Magic, by which part of their work? I'm looking at a question. Were alchemists practicing magic, by which part of their work was to transmute lead to gold, but that required a very advanced state of consciousness and elevated heart and high ethics. I think that the efforts to change lead into gold, physical lead into gold, was a degradation, a downward spiral that alchemists kind of got into. that some alchemists got into later on. Okay, so Jung draws an analogy between the great work of the alchemists. The alchemists talked about the opus, the work. And you have that in Gurdjieff, and you have that in many spiritual traditions. The Agni Yoga work talks about the work, the basic process of reintegration and individuation of the psyche in the modern psychiatric patient is where Jung was taking this. He also said frequently, and the alchemists said this as well, you can't express this, what we're doing, in words. You can't. And that's why they had to use these metaphors. And that's why they were often so Muna, no, don't stop that. Sorry, I talked to my dog there. Words on paper, however, did not seem real enough to me. Something more was needed. I found that in the translators writing in the Red Book. And it's a very major part of alchemical work, that it's an experiential process. It's an experiential process. You can try to describe those experiences through metaphors, through various kinds of ways of, through music, it may even be better, but you can't really get it in those words. So here's just a couple of quotes from the alchemical texts that Jung called attention to. We cannot be resolved of any doubt except by experiment, again, through experiences. And there is no better way to make it than on ourselves. So the alchemist is working on him or herself, as well as perhaps teaching and working with other people. The thing is extracted from you. He's talking about the stone now. One of the key concepts of alchemy is the stone. They're in seeking the stone, what they call the philosopher's stone. And you calling attention to that question? Erica, maybe just tell me what.
There's a question that asks, were Sufis using alchemy in their dervish dance? I just thought that would be,
Don't know. I do know a couple of Sufi teachers that say they're working with alchemy. I don't know exactly how they're doing that and what their methods are. So again, Jung read and wrote about alchemy. He didn't actually do the practices, but saw the relationship of the symbols to dreams and images. Interestingly, around Jung's time, there was also Wilhelm Reich, who focused very, very intensely on the somatic experience of psychological events. And I found a book, a kind of speculative, fictitious book that imagines Jung and Reich having a conversation and talking about their views. As far as I know, I tried to find out, and as far as I know, Jung and Reich never met. But there's absolutely no reason one can't take the insights and teachings of both of them and have them work together. I like this quote from Carl Jung. I think it fits with what we're talking about. It is high time we realize that it is pointless to pursue the light and preach it if nobody can see it. It's much more needed to teach people the art of seeing. Now, the alchemical process, by transmuting all aspects of our personal nature, including our perceptual systems, is elevating our perception to where we see in that higher sense, see, even see light. People often have experiences of seeing the light. and having that light pour through them. Like, and they'll use, depending on their religious or spiritual background, they may interpret it one way or another. But the literal experience of seeing and feeling and sensing and light flowing through us, healing us, bringing us into a state of the goodness and love of the spirit of the universe is often at some point in a psychedelic journey, a very powerful experience. I wanted to go, now how are we doing on time? I'm using up a lot of time, and maybe I could just stop for a minute and see if there are any questions.
Yeah.
Or if that, okay?
Yeah.
We're only going till 9, and I have a whole sequence about alchemy that I could run through more quickly, and an experience I wanted to share.
Alan, why
Yeah.
don't you look at the chat and you know, call on people if you'd like to, or
Right. Well, somebody wrote, Buddhists call it Buddha nature. I think he was probably referring to the stone, and that's, I agree with you, whoever said that. Yeah. It's a state of consciousness. It's a state of consciousness. The stone is not, it's not one of these, although these are wonderful. This is a piece of the earth. This is a stone. But the stone that the alchemists were seeking was something within us. It was an awakening to the freedom of consciousness to essentially choose its own thoughts, its own feelings, its own sensations. Yeah. And clarity and compassion. I'm not seeing anything else really as far as, of course, people have made some interesting comments and about Sufis, but I think I've answered any of the questions in the chat. But if anybody wants to say anything right now, we'll take a few minutes to give you a chance. Maybe stretch your arms, do the Taoist stretch. Okay, well, I'm going to go on. And again, feel free, as Erica has said, to put something in the chat.
Alan, there's a question from Mark in the chat, and Carol Beauvais looks like she has her hand up. So would you like to that question? And
Peter O'Brien asked, did he try to induce these states in any way? What was the context for his experiences? I'm sure there are people on this call that would have a better answer than me, but my understanding is, of course, Jung used his dreams and entering back into his dreams with active imagination to help him move into an altered state. But I think he was also one of these people who was gifted to, by grace, or if you want to call it that, to enter into very, very deep changes in consciousness where he saw things and experienced things and felt things that most people never experience unless they literally do something to induce that change in consciousness. Many people have that. I mean, maybe many of you have had that. Albert Hoffman, who invented LSD, who created the chemical LSD, recognized when he took the LSD that he'd had an experience like that when he was a little child, a cosmic mystical experience where it felt as though everything was just one, and he was not separate from anything. And he had it as a little child, and he never talked to anybody about it. He was a contemporary of Jung, but also they never met. They're both Swiss too.
Carol, did you have a question, my dear? Do you want to unmute? I have to unmute. Unmute.
Go ahead, Carol. Unmute.
Okay.
Okay.
It may be going back a little bit, but I really wondered if you have the time to say more about, for example, Jung's concern about the use of psychedelics in our Western culture. Yeah, and
I don't know if there's anything else I could want to say about it. I would refer you to the letter, because that's almost it. I mean, as far as documentation of what he thought about it and what he said about it, I
Well,
don't know.
does it matter that some people speak of using psychedelics for the words like development, moral development, individuation, versus, as you said, does it matter that some people speak of that and that its availability is explored without those kinds of concepts?
I don't think I understand your question.
I think you answered that, Alan. I think.
Okay.
Yeah, if what you're asking is, can people have these experiences and these awakenings without the use of substances? Absolutely. Absolutely.
No, without any thought of development towards individuation,
I see.
without moral responsibility. He
Yeah.
used that word, you
Yeah,
know.
they can. They
I
can.
mean,
That's
they
a
can, but does it
problem.
matter for us as a society? Does it matter that we have all this without those kinds of words, thoughts? It's like we can develop, we have all kinds of abilities now we're discovering that we can do, but without a larger ethical concept, without words like soul, there's a whole thing missing. So
Absolutely.
I felt one of the reasons I admire Jung so much is that he was, I thought, had this feeling of responsibility for his own development, the person's individual development, but also that one needed to bring something back to the society. He had talked about the moral, the moral development, that the discovery,
I do
we
understand your
can
question.
discover so much.
Carol, I think he answered that. I mean,
Yeah.
In what way?
I'll add to my answer from before and just say it's a very, very important issue, and people are addressing it. And I would refer you to a website called Guiding Presence, which has talks by eminent folk who are elders in looking at the use of altered states, not necessarily through psychedelics, but a lot of them are through psychedelics, Stan Groff for one, and they talk about the issue that you're raising. It's a very important issue. It's definitely being discussed, and
Thank you.
and people are missing out on it. There is a lot of random, careless use without any intention at all to make it healing or individuating. Yeah, one more question, and then because I do want to give you a chance to
Alan,
a little more about alchemy.
there's a question from Joe Coolin. Would the practices of meditation which alters one's consciousness be considered an alchemical experience?
Well, there's different kinds of meditation, and some kinds of forms of meditation are alchemical in the sense that they are aimed at this transmutational process. The work that I did for most of this, pretty much 10 or 11 years in the 70s with Agni Yoga, which I still do, but I was not involved in that particular school anymore, it was totally involved with that, totally involved with meditation practices that were alchemical in nature in that sense. Whereas other forms of meditation can be more focused on individual transcendence and leaving the body. So there's very, very many kinds of meditation, and definitely deep practices of meditation can bring about altered states. I can say for myself, from my own experience, and I know this is true for actually many spiritual teachers in many meditation schools, that, well, it goes in two directions. For me, it was after 10 years of deeply practicing meditation techniques, transformative meditation techniques, and feeling, that it was really, really working and really helpful. When I took a certain psychedelic substance and did those same practices, I felt as if I was doing them for the first time. And I know also from the other end that many Zen teachers, meditation teachers of different kinds, different types of schools, only began looking into it because they had a psychedelic experience. There's a book called Zigzag Zen, which discusses the views of different spiritual and meditation teachers, mostly Buddhist, from the about psychedelics. And then many of them said, no, I don't need to do that anymore. I've had that experience. Now I'm doing the practices that make sense in terms of doing the transformation in a careful, step-by-step way. Different strokes for different folks, that's the way I look at that. Answer, indeed, can be transcended and lead to just absolutely movement. Drumming, rhythmic drumming is an ancient approach to inducing an altered state of consciousness. And many people are practicing that now. Michael Hartley, an anthropologist who kind of went across the boundary, went native, so to speak, and entered into the practices of the people he was sort of scientifically observing and trying to be objective about, entered into ayahuasca ceremony, and it totally changed his life. And he went about studying the practices of what he calls core shamanism. That is shamanism without any particular cultural, I don't mean to say baggage, but forms, just the pure essence of entering into a shamanic state of consciousness, which is essentially an altered state of consciousness. And he does it primarily through rhythmic drumming. It does something to the brain, and then you're out of your brain-mind consciousness and you're on a journey. There are other ways. Vision quest. Ed mentioned going on vision quest. For many years, I took people on vision quests in the desert. And in California, we would fast, we would prepare, and then we would go out into the desert. And then each person would find a place where they would spend solo time for 4 days and nights with just water and stuff to keep warm and safe from the elements. And they would be there in a ritual sort of way with an intention to seek the answers to their questions. And that's a big part of the journey experience as it's practiced now, is that you formulate intentions, questions. What is it you're seeking? What do you want to know about your future, about direction to take? Where do you get guidance? How can you heal experiences that you've had that are in some ways traumatic still inside you? What's the spiritual questions purely that what's the nature of my being and why am I here? So a person would spend 4 days and nights with those questions as their sort of mover, and be in nature and commune with nature and talk to the presence of whatever it was they encountered there. And people had very, very, very powerful, life-changing experiences, often, not always. No one method necessarily brings about a total transformation, including psychedelics, for sure. Reading a question here. Induced insight into the unconscious doesn't have the same hard-won feeling to it. Same with samadhi type states. Yeah, okay. I hear you, Mike. People can read the chat themselves too. Thank you. So let me go on with just as much as I can, presenting you with some of the imagery of alchemy. This image is kind of represents in a way that one could think is just a chemical experiment, but if you open to the possibility that the fire is an inner fire. It comes from within, what some call the cosmic fire, and the vessel is you, is your body and your mind. And it's going through a process. It's going through a process, and that's kind of what alchemy is about.
Yeah, I'm back.
So let's go to the next one. So one of the ways that Jung was moved to see that alchemy was very much like what he was calling the individuation process, the integration, the whole to seek wholeness, was their emphasis on what's called conjunctio. And that is the process of bringing together the separate polarities within us, which of course is expressed, we think, as male and female. Now, my understanding of Jung, and again, people could correct me if I'm wrong, is that he tended to emphasize that a man needs to focus primarily on the inner woman, the anima, and that a woman would need to focus primarily on the male, the animus. My understanding of the alchemists is that they really saw us in that sense as both male and female, and that these are two parts of one individual, also expressed as the sun and the moon, and you see the light of the star, helping them begin the process of coming together. They're fully clothed, they're in their roles as king and queen and whoever they are, bankers and doctors and nurses and so forth. And they're extending a hand and they're beginning to relate to each other. And then the next slide, you'll see that something has they've begun a process of change. They've taken off their clothes. So that's a process of, and often this is experienced in a deep journey, a deep altered state experience, is that one is shedding skins or masks or armor or coverings, things that cover us, in which we are hidden from others and from ourselves. And you see the two, the male and the female, are getting a little bit closer. Both hands are reaching across. And I can't translate what these things say. I'm sure they're quite significant. Again, sun and moon. It's this polarity of dynamic and magnetic, outgoing and receptive. That is the basic coming together within ourselves. And so we're on a journey. You know, very, very often in the old days, in the 60s, people would take LSD and they would take their clothes off. Somehow they were impelled to take their clothes off and they'd go walking around naked and they'd get into trouble. And it was an externalization of what they were being shown, which was to take off and open themselves to the world and to their soul. Okay, next one, you see they're sitting in a tub. And again, the tub is the solution, the solutio. They use that word in the dissolving This is helping them dissolve. They're naked, they're relating. Again, you have this, the dove, the light coming down, and that's what's helping the process of to unfold, to deepen. So they're going through again, a more deep dissolving. There was the dissolving, letting off the garments. Now their whole bodies are immersed in it. And then the next one, there's much deeper intimacy between the male and the female, the anima, the animus, if you will, the sun and the moon. They're making love, they're lying down. And then in the next one, I think there was one in between, but maybe I think they're reversed, but that's okay. So now what's happening here is they're so merged that they're one body and two heads. And that's so partially, to a great extent, it's the two parts of us, the two polarities that have been separated are now coming together. Now that's also another important point in alchemy, is separation. In the beginning, we had this man and woman. Even though we're really just one person, we separate out the two parts. And in a guided divination or journey, one can bring attention to each of the separate parts of their nature before they bring them together. There's something about separating things. It's like the alchemists talked about how in the beginning, we're one big dark mass. Everything's all jumbled together and it's confusion and it's neurosis or psychosis. And then we separate out the elements. We separate out the parts, the man and the woman, the earth, the air, the fire, and we have attention on each one. And then they're more conscious and they can come together. So this is a part of the union of the male and the female in the one person. And I think the next one actually preceded that one. So it's just the one from before where they were naked and intimate, and now they're winged. So you see, it's really taking on a spiritual dimension. It's not just a psychological dimension. People don't generally have wings in the ordinary world. And then there's this where they're rising up. They have mastery over and with the reptilian. They didn't kill the reptilian. I noticed that. They have sort of a mastery and engagement with the reptilian, riding on the rim of the moon, and then one more. And now you see there's just one being, one being. This is the individuated self, wholeness. And one is now in union with one's true nature, the goal of alchemy. And that is that you are aware of and in union with the being of light that you are, the spirit that you are. And it's something that one can experience through a wide variety of means. And I've been emphasizing the psychedelic aspect of how that can be amplified. Just a couple more slides that aren't about that progression, but this is a kind, and I can't remember where I got this. I don't know if it was an Alex Gray carving but it's a very elaborate portrayal, again, of the process of conjunctio, the coming together, with the tree of life being at the center. Many guides call attention to that central column that I mentioned before. In a very literal way, can feel like it's a tree. It's a tree of life with the branches reaching up into the sky and the roots reaching down into the earth and into with our ancestors. And so again, one more slide. that portrays a pair of alchemists kneeling by the furnace and praying for God's blessing, and which is kind of the goal, to open to God's blessing. One more that illustrates the conjunctio process, again, without human forms being involved. And just to give you an illustration, there's many alchemical drawings in Jung's, in the book Psychology and Alchemy. So I think, are there any more slides? No, I think that's all the slides. So let me just kind of come back to you. And the experience we need to stop at 9, is that correct?
Right, correct.
Yeah. So the experience I was going to share with you, it wouldn't be doing it justice to do it with just 10 minutes. So,
Alan?
but let me tell you a little bit about it, and maybe you'll get a sense of the possibility there. Go ahead, Erica, what were you going to say?
Well, there was a question I think is interesting from Pam. What is one to make of the fact that the individuated being is imaged without a body?
In that last slide, well, the body is the body of light in that image. I mean, it's not to be taken as a literal image. None of those are. I mean, you don't end up looking like that at the end of the process. You still have a body, you still have 2 arms and 2 legs, and but it feels like that. It feels like that. It makes sense that you are that, and that you are that living in a body, living in a mind and a body, living in a realm of thoughts, and yet you are not those thoughts. You're living in a realm of emotions, and yet you are not those emotions. And you're living in a body, and that isn't all of who you are. So it's a vehicle. That's an alchemical teaching, I would say. So
there are a couple more you want just towards the end of that one, or just
could somebody who wrote that? It's a long thing. Could you just ask it out loud? Just
Lisa Rasto, would you like to unmute?
Hi, that's me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so it's a long question. I am very curious about the psychedelic experience, and I do a lot of meditation and shamanic journeying and have other ways to get there, but I have been interested in experiencing it, and I love everything you're sharing. I think it's such a splitting of the veils. I think it could be in such a dramatic way that guidance seems really important. And so my question is really about safety and boundaries, that if you're opening your heart and psyche in that kind of way, do you set intentions to connect with benign entities? Because if you're going on a journey, you may come across other things that, like the ghosts, as Jung says, might you encounter something that you don't want coming back with you, a hitchhiker in a sense. I hope that's not too bizarre a question, but it's one that I would want to understand how boundaries are set.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Somebody wrote you need a guide, but you need an experienced guide. You need a guide who really knows the territory. And that's why I would recommend that website, Guiding Presence. There are other places, but those are people who are reflecting on the importance of the integrity, the experience, the knowledge of the guide, of the person who's going to be with the person going on a journey. And that's true, really it's true for any of these methods. And if you're going to go on a vision quest, you have to have a guide that takes you on that request and helps you prepare and helps you and holds the space even while you're out there, and helps you with integrating your experience. And that's true of a shamanic journey. These are very, 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 very potent experiences often. And so it is important. There's a whole training program in California. The California Institute of Integral Studies has a whole program training psychotherapists as psychedelic guides. I don't know if the requirement is that you actually become a licensed psychotherapist. I'm not sure, but it's a full training program, a full degree program where they learn everything from the chemistry to the only thing is, because at least in California, it's still illegal to do this, except under very, very strict guidelines in these research programs that are at these medical colleges and so forth. They can't do it. So they're getting this training, but they're getting the training without the experience, presumably. What people do when they're not in class is probably up to them. So they could be having experiences. But the important thing for a guide absolutely has to have had the experience. He or she should have many experiences on both ends. And in other words, assisting with experiences as well as before they become guiding people. And unfortunately, as somebody was asking a question before about the cautions and so forth, not everybody is doing that. There's money in this. It's becoming a big thing. As I often say it kind of kiddingly, it's mushrooming all over the culture. And there's all kinds of stuff going on. So yeah, safety is very, very important. Careful guidance is important. Set and setting is of course, I didn't talk much about that in this talk, but it's the core of what makes the journey constructive or not. The set is what you are prepared, what you know in your own conscious mind, and even what's going on in your unconscious, what you're not aware of inside yourself. Some fears or dilemmas, but that's okay. You have the conscious intention, and you have the guide, and then you have a setting. That's what's outside your body, whether it's a room or whether you're in nature or whether you're in whether there's music or whether you're wearing eye shades, which is why most people are doing these psycho-spiritual experiences now. They use eye shades. They're not relating to the external world at all during the journey. They're going in. They're going in. Exactly where I think Jungian teaching helps people go, inside. And then you bring that, you come back. You come back. Like I said, Jung seemed to have kind of a bit of a bummer about coming back. The coming back is important and significant. When one is prepared for the altered state and prepared even for the coming back, because you always come back. You don't stay in that state of consciousness. Even if you keep taking the drug, it won't work. And so you need to be prepared for the experience itself and prepared for the coming back, and then to some extent guided or helped in the integration of the experience. All very, very important. And, perhaps if he had understood, he was taken into that spontaneously. That was not an act, as far as I understand, his near-death experience was not an active imagination, intentional thing. He just got there. It was scary, and it was profound, obviously, and it changed his life.
Alan?
Yeah.
Do we have time in 4 minutes for you to say a little bit about what you were going to say about your experience?
Okay. About the experience I was going to go. Yeah. So the conjunctio that I just showed you, that sequence of pictures is actually something that you can experience inside yourself. And Ralph Metzner developed a whole series of what he called divinations. In other words, guided meditational processes to access healing and guidance. And one of them is this integration of the male and female aspects of ourselves, the conjunctio. And so you can, with intention, bring your attention and then experience the feminine aspect of your nature, which from a yoga energy practice perspective and experience is the left side of your body and energy field. And so that's where she is, man or woman. She's kind of there, and that from that tradition, and it's been my experience that this works that way. And then by bringing your attention, focusing your intention to experience the male, and then bringing your attention to the right side of your body and your energy field. And one of the things these substances do is they can enhance deeply somatic awareness. It really helps if people are already trained in how to do that, but you don't have to kind of get it. As a guide can help you with that. But so you're guided to experience the inner woman, which connects to the divine feminine. It connects you to the divine feminine to heal the inner woman. All of your experiences with feminine and women in your life, your mother, your grandmother, your sisters, and all that. And then on the male side, the divine masculine. And then just like in that picture, you envision them, but you literally feel them. That's what I mean by literally feel the man and the woman coming together, reaching across the middle and making love. And that love becomes you. That loving being becomes the one that you are. That's the shortest way I've ever told anybody about that experience, because in some ways it really is something that one benefits from mostly if you experience it. But that gives you a sense of it. I see that it's actually literally 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
And so
Thank
I
you.
want to
Thank you, Alan.
say thank you all very much for listening. I did a lot of talking, and I hope you benefit, as have I, from sharing this with you.
And thank you. And please donate if